The city had not seen anything like it in years. Every morning for 11 straight days, New Yorkers walking past a newsstand got the same thing. 2 front pages, 2 tabloids, 1 story. The Daily News on the left, the New York Post on the right, and somewhere between them the wreckage of a marriage that had once been as much a New York institution as the buildings with the man's name on them. It started on February 11th, 1990. Liz Smith, gossip columnist, Daily News, a woman who knew the couple socially and never pretended otherwise, broke it in her column. The marriage was over. The split was real. And from that morning forward, the story did not leave the front page for a week and a half. What followed was less journalism than theater, and everyone in it knew their part. Smith's coverage landed unmistakably on one side. Ivana Trump was the loyal one, the working partner, the woman who had helped build the empire, now discarded in favor of someone 20 years younger. The framing was so consistent, so loaded in one direction, that it became its own kind of story. Newsweek would eventually put the couple on the cover, February 26th, under the headline, "The War of the Trumps." And the magazine noted plainly that the pro-Ivana tilt in the early coverage had not been accidental. Someone had wanted the story told that way. Someone had made sure Liz Smith was the one telling it. When you control the first chapter, you shape everything that comes after. Donald Trump's side understood this too, and responded the way his side usually responded, by flooding the zone with a different document. Within days, the prenuptial agreement, the contract that had governed the marriage from before the wedding, was leaked to the press. The message was clear. Whatever Ivana's attorneys were about to argue in court, Trump wanted the public to know the deal had been in writing all along. He called it airtight. He called it fair. He called it modern. He told the Post he liked Ivana. He told them they had simply grown apart. And then, in the same breath, he said her arrogance had gotten worse over the years, and that he had no interest in ending up with another Leona Helmsley. That last comparison was not casual. Leona Helmsley was, at that precise moment in February of 1990, on her way to federal prison for tax evasion. She had been convicted the previous summer. The tabloids had spent years turning her into something close to a cartoon villain, the hotel queen who supposedly told her staff that only little people pay taxes. To invoke her name in the same sentence as your wife, to a reporter, on the record, was not an expression of frustration. It was a weapon, aimed at the woman who had spent over a decade running his properties. Meanwhile, across town at the Post, the editors were preparing something that would define the entire episode in popular memory. On February 16th, 5 days into the siege, the paper ran a front page quoting Marla Maples, the woman at the center of all of this, on the subject of Donald Trump's sexual performance. The quote was explicit enough to become instantly famous and instantly repeated. Maples has denied ever saying it. According to Jill Brokaw, who was a Post columnist at the time and wrote about it in 2018, the editors ran the page for one reason above all others. They were absolutely certain Trump would never sue over it. Whatever embarrassment the story carried, he would not be the one to put it before a judge. They were right. He did not sue. The page ran, the quote spread, and it did something the Post editors may not have fully anticipated. It made Trump look ridiculous rather than powerful, and it drove enormous sympathy straight back toward Ivana. Trump lost the press war. He lost it badly enough that he reportedly told people he was going to buy the Daily News specifically so he could fire Liz Smith. He did not buy it. Smith kept her column. But here's the thing about what was actually happening in February of 1990. Almost none of the noise from those 11 days mattered. Not the leaked prenup, not the Helmsley comparison, not the headline on the Post, not Smith's column, not the Newsweek cover. All of it, every front page, every quote, every countermove, was performance. The marriage was not exploding in real time on those newsstands. It had already been unwinding, slowly and quietly, through a stack of documents that predated most of those buildings with his name on them. The real story was not on a front page. It was in a filing cabinet. The prenuptial agreement that Trump's side leaked to reporters was not the first one, and it was not the last one. There had been 4 of them, revised and renegotiated across the span of the marriage. The original had been drafted in March of 1977, a full month before the wedding. It had been put together by Roy Cohn, the man who served as Trump's attorney, fixer, and most important mentor through those years. Cohn had previously served as chief counsel to Senator Joseph McCarthy. His client list by the 1970s included figures from organized crime. He was not a man who wrote gentle documents. His written advice on the subject of prenuptial agreements, later reported by the New York Times, was, "Plan now for the day the relationship goes down the drain." That philosophy was visible in every clause. The 1977 agreement contained a provision that would eventually become central to the divorce proceedings. If the couple separated, Ivana was to return everything he had given her during the marriage, not divide it, not split it, but return it. Cars, furs, jewelry, rings. Not a sharing of assets, a retrieval of inventory. Trump, in accounts reported later, pointed toward Cohn as the architect. The terms were what they were. The villain, at least in Trump's public telling, wore a dead man's face. Roy Cohn died in 1986. There was another detail about that first negotiation that Ivana's divorce lawyers would later use as a central argument in their challenge to the agreement. The attorney who represented her at the table in March of 1977, the lawyer who was supposed to be looking out for her interests, had professional and personal ties to Trump's own circle. In 1977, this arrangement had perhaps read as a matter of convenience, the way things were done in certain rooms in New York. By 1990, when her legal team was trying to dismantle the agreement, it looked considerably different. It looked like the beginning of a story about a woman who had never quite been on the same footing as the man across the table, no matter what her title said. Because that is the thing you have to hold on to when you look at the tabloid war. The front pages, the leaked documents, the Helmsley line. Everything that happened in February of 1990 was loud. Everything that settled the case happened in silence, in rooms most people never heard about, in documents most people never read. The press war was the story New York got to watch. The other story, the one that started years before any of this, the one built from contracts and clauses, and a negotiation that may or may not have been what it appeared, that story was never going to fit on a front page. To understand how those 11 days in February were even possible, how a divorce between two private individuals became the dominant news story in the country's largest city for a week and a half, you have to go back much further than February. You have to go back past the prenup, past the wedding, past the first meeting in a Manhattan restaurant. You have to go back to a factory town in Czechoslovakia that the communists had renamed after a dead party leader. You have to go back to a girl who started skiing at 4 years old and understood, from the time she was very young, that a document, the right document, in the right hands, could be the difference between staying and leaving, between being seen and being invisible, between a life that was chosen and one that was assigned. The woman at the center of those 11 front pages did not arrive in New York by accident. She arrived by design. Her own design, mostly, but also, as it turned out, everyone else's. The town was called Gottwald when she was born there in 1949. The communists had renamed it after Clement Gottwald, the first president of the Czechoslovak People's Republic, a man who had overseen the post-war purges with enough enthusiasm to earn a place in the party's official iconography. The name did not last. After the regime fell, the town went back to what it had always been called before the ideology arrived, Zlín, a mid-sized manufacturing center in the Moravian region built around the shoe factory, functional and unglamorous in the way that most industrial towns behind the Iron Curtain were functional and unglamorous. This is where Ivana Marie Zelničková grew up, not in glamour, not in privilege, in a place where the state named your streets and read your mail and decided, ultimately, how far you were allowed to travel. Her father, Milo Stelniček, was an electrical engineer. Her mother worked as a telephone operator. They were not dissidents. They were not party loyalists in any ideological sense. They were people doing what people did in that system, navigating it, finding the edges of it, keeping their heads down enough to live a recognizable life inside it. What they gave their daughter, among other things, was access to skis. She started at 4 years old. By the time she was a teenager, she was good enough to make the Czechoslovak junior national ski team. This matters for reasons that go beyond athletic accomplishment. Team travel was one of the very few mechanisms available to a young Czech citizen for seeing the world on the other side of the Iron Curtain and, crucially, being allowed to come back. Most routes out of the country were one way. The ski team was a pass. You competed, you traveled, you returned. The state permitted it because the state wanted medals. Ivana used it because she wanted to see what was outside Zlín. Here is where the first gap opens between the documented Ivana and the actual one, a gap that would widen and complicate her story for decades. At various points in her life, it was claimed, and she did not always contradict, that she had been an alternate on the Czechoslovak Olympic ski team at the 1972 Winter Games in Sapporo. It was a good detail. It sounded right. It fit the image. But in 1989, Peter Pomezny, then serving as Secretary General of the Czechoslovak Olympic Committee, stated publicly that he had searched the records and found no evidence of her Olympic involvement whatsoever. And there was a harder problem than the absence of her name from any roster. Czechoslovakia did not send a single female alpine skier to the 1972 Winter Games. Not one. The claim was not just unverified, it described something that had not happened. Snopes confirmed the roster point in 2021. The Olympics were not part of her story. They were part of a version of her story. The distinction between those two things would prove to be a recurring feature of her life. But the real biography was already interesting enough without the embellishment. In 1971, she married Alfred Winkelmeyer, an Austrian ski instructor. Ivana and people close to her described him consistently as a friend, not a romantic partner. She later called it a Cold War marriage and said plainly it was never consummated. What it was, in practical terms, was a transaction of survival. The marriage produced an Austrian passport issued in March of 1972. That passport meant she could leave Czechoslovakia as an Austrian national, not as a Czech citizen defecting, which would have been treated as a crime, but as a foreign national visiting her home country. She could go and come back. She could see her parents without becoming a fugitive. For a woman from Zlín in the early 1970s, that document was not a marriage certificate. It was an exit visa with a return ticket attached. She obtained an absentee divorce in Los Angeles in 1973, by which point Winkelmeyer had moved there to teach skiing. And then she moved on, as she had always moved on, practically, efficiently, with the kind of forward momentum that does not pause long enough to reconsider. By this point, she was living in Montreal, where she had settled with George Shirotek, a Czech skier she had known since 1967. Shirotek had defected in 1971. Together in Montreal, they built something approximating a life. She opened a ski boutique, worked as a ski instructor, and began modeling for a Canadian agency. During this period, she told people she was married to Shirotek. She was not. They never married. It was another version, a presented version, a functional one, that served social purposes better than the more complicated truth did. Before any of this, before Montreal and the boutique and the Austrian passport, there had been someone else. His name was Jerzy Stoll, known in some transliterated accounts as Jerry Stadl, a well-known Prague lyricist. She had been involved with him before the years that produced the passport and the escape and the Canadian modeling work. He was killed in a car crash in 1973. During the press siege of 1990, in the middle of the divorce and the tabloid war and the lawyers and the leaks, Ivana gave an interview to Ladies' Home Journal and said something quietly devastating. She said that before all of this, she had known exactly one tragedy in her life. She meant Stoll. It is a sentence worth sitting with, that the loss of a young man in a car crash in Prague measured to her as a singular grief in a life that had already contained the Iron Curtain, an arranged marriage of convenience, a passport obtained through legal fiction, and the loss of a country she could only visit on approved terms. In the middle of all this movement, the skiing, the passport, the defection-adjacent maneuvers, the Montreal years, she was also, apparently, studying. The FBI eventually confirmed that she had earned a master's degree in physical education from Charles University in Prague in 1972. But when the documents were examined more carefully, in October of 1989, the same year New Jersey gaming regulators were reviewing Trump's casino operations and looking at everyone connected to them, federal investigators found something more complicated. An FBI document from that month described her immigration and naturalization file as fraught with inconsistencies. Dates of residence, periods of schooling, employment history. She had told the New Jersey Division of Gaming Enforcement that she had studied at Charles University until 1973. There was no mention anywhere of time spent in Austria. No other indication she had attended the university at all, beyond the degree that was eventually confirmed. The pattern that had started with the Olympics was still running. None of which is unusual exactly for someone who had spent her formative years in a system that turned every official record into an instrument of control. When the state owns the documents, you learn to manage them. You learn which version to present, to whom, and for what purpose. Ivana Zelnichkova grew up in a place where the paperwork version of your life and the lived version were understood to be two separate things, and where knowing how to navigate the distance between them was not dishonesty, it was survival. She met Donald Trump in 1976 at a restaurant in Manhattan. He was 30 years old, still substantially inside his father Fred's orbit, operating out of Queens with an outer borough name and a ferocious appetite for being taken seriously in a city that had not yet decided to take him seriously. The deal he was chasing at the time, the conversion of the old Commodore Hotel next to Grand Central Station into what would become the Grand Hyatt, was the project that would change his address, socially and professionally, from Queens to Manhattan. He was not yet the person his name would come to represent. He was someone in the process of becoming that person. She was 27, newly arrived from Montreal, with a Czech accent and a model's bearing, and, behind it, a decade of calculated movement across borders that most people in the room that night would not have been able to navigate at any price. They married in April of 1977. The date is slightly contested. Different accounts give it as the 7th or the 9th, and the family's own records have never fully settled the question. The ceremony was held at Marble Collegiate Church on Fifth Avenue, officiated by Norman Vincent Peale, author of The Power of Positive Thinking, and the Trump family's longtime pastor. Her father, Miloš Zelnicek, flew in from Zlín to watch his daughter get married in Manhattan. He arrived at the airport and his belongings were searched. The search was carried out on the orders of an officer of the STB, the Czechoslovak State Security Service. Researchers at the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes in Prague, working from the Security Service's own archive files, later described what happened at that airport not as a random customs inspection, but as a message. Permission to visit his daughter in America had been conditional. The search was the condition being made visible. That same year, 1977, the year of the wedding, Miloš Zelnicek began cooperating with the STB. The service opened a long-running surveillance operation on the couple. The operation's code name was her first name, Ivana. And so, the wedding of April 1977 produced two records simultaneously. One was a marriage license, filed in New York. The other was a report filed by a secret police collaborator in the country she had used a stranger's name to escape. The contract was in place. The file was open. Both documents would run, in their separate ways, for the better part of the next 13 years. She did not arrive as a decorative figure. That is the part that the tabloids would later flatten, the part that has been easiest to forget. That in the middle years of the marriage, Ivana Trump was not the wife at the end of the table. She was a working executive at the center of an empire that had not yet figured out what it was becoming. The Grand Hyatt came first. The project that converted the tired old Commodore Hotel next to Grand Central Terminal into the kind of property that bankers would cross town to be photographed in front of. That project was the hinge Donald Trump's reputation turned on. It was the deal that moved him, permanently, from Queens to Manhattan. And Ivana was put in charge of the interiors. She worked on the redesign of public spaces, on materials, on the vocabulary of the place. It was her first formal assignment in the organization, and the way it was framed at the time was clear. She was not being given a job to keep her busy. She was being given a job because no one else was going to do it the way he wanted it done. Then came Trump Tower. The pink marble atrium, the brass, the cascading waterfall, the gilded, theatrical, deeply specific interior that became the visual shorthand for what a Trump property was supposed to look like for the next decade. Much of it was, in its detail, hers. The specifications, the mood, the decisions about what kind of ostentation was going to define the Trump aesthetic in the 80s. She was given a title for this work, Vice President of Interior Design for the Trump Organization. She was not just supervising finishes, she was helping build the brand. And then came Atlantic City. In the mid-80s, Trump acquired a casino property there, Trump's Castle, and installed Ivana as its president. She ran the operation. 4,000 employees, a casino floor that ran on shift rotations, comps, surveillance, marketing, payroll, and the kind of logistics that could swallow a person whole if she did not understand the machinery. She did understand the machinery. People close to the operation, including Ivana herself in later years, would say it plainly. He would not have gotten as far as he did without her. That is not a figure of speech. It is a description of what actually happened during those years, when Donald Trump was stretching himself across Manhattan and the New Jersey coast simultaneously and needed someone he trusted to hold one of those things together while he worked on the other. There is a telling detail in her early relationship to the Atlantic City decision. She had argued against it on the simplest possible grounds. The city had no airport. How do you run a luxury hotel and casino for high-rolling visitors who cannot fly in directly? The objection was practical and unglamorous, the kind of objection that tends to get overridden by men with capital who have already decided. She lost the argument. Then she went down to Atlantic City and made the property work anyway. This is a pattern. Argue, lose, execute. 3 children came out of these years. Donald Jr., born 1977, the year of the wedding. Ivanka, born 1981. Eric, born 1984. The mother spoke to them in Czech. She sent them, every summer, back to Zlín to stay with her parents in the apartment in the communist factory town. No staff, no driver, no yacht, no marble. A small flat in a place where the state still named the streets. Donald Jr. came out of those summers fluent in Czech. Ivanka picked up fragments. Eric, who was born last, after her parents' circumstances had begun to change and the regime was approaching its end, never really got Czech at all. The 3 summers in Zlín are documented with an unusual kind of precision, not because anyone in the family kept a careful diary, because the STB kept one. Miloš Zelnicek had been classified as a conspiratorial informer. From 1977 onward, beginning, almost impossibly, the year of the wedding, he had been feeding local office reports on his daughter's life in America and his son-in-law's business dealings. His phone calls with Ivana were tapped. His mail was read. The cooperation lasted until the regime collapsed. Czech historian Peter Blaskov, who has worked the files with care, has been cautious about how to interpret what Zelnicek actually passed along. The picture that emerges from his research is not that of a deeply embedded spy who handed over state secrets. Zelnicek was a mechanic. He was an amateur sports coach. He wanted to see his grandchildren. The price of the airport gate, the permission to fly out of Zlín and visit Manhattan, was a conversation with a ministry man every so often. What he passed along, in Blaskov's careful reading, was material the service could generally get elsewhere. There is no sign he handed over anything genuinely compromising about his daughter or her husband. He was, by all available evidence, a small man in a small apartment, doing what a lot of small men did in that system to keep their lives from getting smaller. One document from those files is worth pausing on, because it is the only contemporary record of a particular kind of ambition. Dated October 22, 1988, an STB report records that Donald Trump had declined pressure to run for president that year because at 42 he considered himself too young, but that he intended to run in 1996 as an independent and was confident he would win. The report allows, even as it records, that this looks like fantasy. The source, the file notes, was Ivana, talking to her father about her husband's ambitions during a visit in 1988. It is striking to read now, in part because of what came later. In public at the time, the only version of this that made it into American popular consciousness was the Oprah appearance in which Trump said he would not rule out running and that he thought he would win if he tried. The Czech Secret Services, it turns out, kept a cleaner record of his stated intentions than the American press did. By 1988, Trump was buying the Plaza Hotel. The price, around $400 million, was widely considered to be too much, even by people inclined to be sympathetic to his deal-making. He announced the purchase at a press conference and used the occasion to make a different announcement. Ivana would be the president of the Plaza. The line he delivered to the room, as later reported by Marie Brenner in her September 1990 Vanity Fair account, has become the kind of sentence people quote to explain an entire marriage. He said his wife was a brilliant manager. He said he would pay her $1 a year. He said she could have all the dresses she could buy. The room, per Brenner's reporting, took it the way rooms took things from him, as performance, as Trump being Trump. Afterward, Ivana called friends in tears. She asked them how he could humiliate her that way. The Plaza was being sold to her as a coronation. She understood it, at least by then, as something else. A friend told Brenner the truth of what had been happening. By the late 80s, Trump had become so fixed on Marla Maples that he was neglecting the business. Maples was in Atlantic City by 1988. The affair, per Brenner's reporting, was well underway before Ivana knew about it. Some later accounts dated as far back as 1985. The geography was brutal and visible. His wife was running a casino in the same small coastal city where his girlfriend was staying. Brenner reports the choice Trump put to her: come back to New York and be his wife and mother to his children, or take the hotel. He framed it as options. It functioned as a transfer order. She took the plaza. She took the nominal salary. She took the title. She took a hotel in New York, 120 miles from where her husband's actual life was unfolding on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. She had, in effect, been promoted out of the room. The $1-a-year joke was not a joke. It was a public humiliation delivered as affection in front of reporters at the announcement of a property she would now spend her days running. She went home and cried about it. She did not, however, decline the assignment. She went to the plaza and ran it. This is the partnership years. They are usually described, in the simplified versions that survive in popular memory, as Ivana the Trophy and Donald the Mogul. The real partnership was operational. She made his buildings work. She made his casino work. She helped him become the name on the building. And she did it while her father, in a small apartment a continent away, reported on her conversations to a service that opened a file on her the same year she got married, and that kept that file open through every interior she designed, every hotel she ran, and every phone call she made to her children about their summers in Zlin. December of 1989, Aspen. A day on the mountain, per the version of the story she would eventually publish in her 2017 memoir. A young blonde woman she did not recognize approached her and announced, in the middle of a ski slope, that she loved Ivana's husband. The woman, Ivana wrote, asked whether Ivana did too. Ivana wrote that she told the woman to get lost, that she loved her husband, and that it was unladylike to behave this way, but that she was in shock. That is one version. In 1991, sitting with Barbara Walters, Ivana gave a different version of the same encounter on the same day on the same slope. In that telling, she had approached a friend of Maples to ask whether the rumor about her husband was true, not realizing that Maples herself was standing right there. Two arrangements of who spoke first. Same ski resort, same year, two different accounts of who initiated the conversation. Biographers have noted, separately, that Trump is reported to have arranged for Maples to be in Aspen that week while his family was there. Whatever the precise sequence, what happened next is the part that is not contested. She confronted him. Per her later account, she gave him a choice. He chose Marla Maples. By early February of 1990, just before flying to Tokyo for the Tyson versus Douglas fight, Trump told Ivana he was leaving. His hired spokesman described it to reporters in the language of polite exhaustion. Things had simply not worked out. The framing was meant to make the dissolution look like the natural conclusion of an unhappy arrangement. It was not going to look like that for very long. On February 11, 1990, Liz Smith's column in the Daily News reported the marriage was finished. Trump returned from Japan to a banner headline. The coverage, as it unfolded, was unmistakably, almost aggressively pro-Ivana, the loyal wife, the working partner, the woman discarded for someone 20 years younger. The framing was not accidental, as Newsweek's later cover story noted. It had been engineered. Smith's column had not appeared by chance. It had been placed by people who wanted the story told a particular way. Ivana hired two men who would shape the rest of the year: Michael Kennedy, divorce attorney, John Scanlon, public relations. Trump, characteristically, went around the lawyers and took the fight to the press. His side leaked the prenuptial agreement to the media. The message was direct. Whatever she was about to argue in court, the deal had been in writing since before the wedding. He told the New York Post he liked Ivana. He told them they had grown apart. He said her arrogance had gotten worse over the years. He said he did not want another Leona Helmsley. And he said the prenuptial agreement was airtight, fair, and modern. The Helmsley comparison landed the way it was designed to land. Leona Helmsley was, at that moment, on her way to federal prison for tax evasion, convicted the summer before. The woman whose employees quoted her as saying only little people pay taxes. To compare your wife, in print, on the record, to a figure who had become the universal caricature of a monstrous New York operator was not a slip, it was a knife. Then came the page that became the symbol of the whole affair. On February 16th, the New York Post ran a front page quoting Marla Maples on Donald Trump's sexual performance. The quote was explicit enough to enter permanent circulation in the popular memory of the divorce. Maples has denied ever saying it. Jill Brokaw, then a Post columnist, wrote in 2018 about how the page came together. Her account is specific and worth taking seriously. The editors ran it because they were absolutely certain of one thing: Donald Trump would never sue them over it. Whatever embarrassment the quote carried, he would not be the one to put it before a judge. They were right. He did not sue. The page ran, the quote spread across the country, and it did the opposite of what it was meant to do. Instead of humiliating Maples or salting Ivana's wounds publicly, it made Trump look ridiculous. It drove sympathy back toward the woman he had left. Trump lost the press war badly enough that he told people he was going to buy the Daily News so he could fire Liz Smith. He did not buy the Daily News. Smith kept her column. Newsweek's cover followed on February 26th under the headline, "The War of the Trumps," with a careful observation that the pro-Ivana framing in the early coverage had a purpose. The headline was not a description. It was an acknowledgement that both sides had been using the press as a weapon. Meanwhile, behind the front pages, the lawyers were doing what lawyers do. Kennedy's team went after the prenuptial agreements on a structural ground. Ivana had never had genuinely independent representation when the first one was signed in March of 1977, and every agreement built on top of that first one had inherited the original defect. They were not arguing that the marriage had failed. They were arguing that the documents that governed the failure had never been what they appeared to be. In a filing reviewed later by the Daily Beast, her lawyers wrote that over the 3 years preceding the divorce, he had increasingly verbally abused and demeaned her in order to obtain her submission to his wishes, and that he had humiliated and verbally assaulted her. This was a contemporaneous court document, not a memoir written years later. It was sworn to in the language of filings, and it became part of the public record of the marriage. There were 4 successive prenuptial agreements negotiated over the course of the marriage. The original, drafted by Roy Cohn in 1977, contained the provision that would later become central. In the event of separation, Ivana would return what she had been given, not a division of assets, a return of inventory. Trump's public posture, as he was losing the press war, was to blame Cohn for the terms. Cohn had died in 1986. The villain in the story Trump wanted to tell wore a dead man's face. In October of 1990, Milos Zelnicek died of a heart attack at age 63. His daughter was in the middle of one of the most public divorces in New York history. He had been cooperating with the STB from the year of her wedding. His phone tapped, his mail read, his conversations with her about her husband's ambitions recorded and filed. The file closed with him, as the regime that ran it had already collapsed the year before. In November, the funeral was held in Zlín. Donald Trump flew to Czechoslovakia. He stood next to his soon-to-be ex-wife through the service, in front of her mother, in front of her country, in front of the cameras. There is no evidence the gesture softened a single term of the settlement that was being negotiated down the hall, on another continent, by other men in other suits. In December of 1990, the divorce was granted on the grounds of cruel and inhuman treatment by Donald Trump. He did not contest that characterization. It is in the judgment. The word cruelty is in the judgment of the court. The settlement was signed on March 22, 1991. Its terms, as reported, $10 million in cash payable within 90 days, $350,000 a year in maintenance, $300,000 a year in child support, the 45-room house in Greenwich, an apartment in the Trump Organization's New York building, use of the Palm Beach estate. Press reports put the total value at around $25 million, though the figures varied. The New York Post reported the cash portion as $14 million, while other accounts placed it at $10 million. The discrepancy was never fully resolved in public. New York divorce records are not open to inspection. She also signed paragraphs 9 and 10. Paragraphs 9 and 10 of the settlement barred her from publishing or causing to be published any diary, memoir, letter, story, photograph, interview, article, essay, account, or description or depiction of any kind whatsoever, whether fictionalized or not, concerning her marriage to Donald Trump or any other aspect of his personal, business, or financial affairs. Breached the paragraphs, and the payments stopped, the benefits terminated, and he could seek an injunction. In May of 1991, Judge Phyllis Gangel Jacob set the 2 paragraphs aside on First Amendment grounds, after her attorney argued they abridged her constitutional rights. Trump's lawyer announced that the ruling changed nothing about her contractual liability. In April of 1992, the appellate division held the confidentiality provision enforceable and ruled that the lower court had excluded it from the judgment without notice or explanation. In June of that year, the same court unanimously reaffirmed and cleared him to sue her. In October of 1992, New York's highest court declined to hear her appeal. She had tried, through the courts, to get free of the paragraphs. The courts gave the money to her and the silence to him. The divorce had been granted on grounds of cruelty. The confidentiality clause was upheld on grounds of contract. Two truths, both of them in the official record, both of them on paper. The press war of February 1990 was, in the end, the loudest part of a story that was being decided in quieter rooms. The front pages moved on. The documents did not. The contract that had been signed in March of 1977, drafted by Roy Cohn, negotiated across a table where she had not had genuinely independent counsel, outlived the marriage it had been written to govern. And the man who lost the press war that winter kept, in the end, the thing he had always wanted most to keep: control of the record. She had been gagged, so she started gagging people. In 1992, Ivana Trump published a novel. It was called For Love Alone. It told the story of a beautiful European woman who marries a rich, ruthless American and is betrayed by him. It was, in the formal sense, fiction. It was, in every other sense, a document. Her lawyer in the matter was Floyd Abrams, one of the most prominent First Amendment litigators in the country. Abrams said the obvious thing that needed to be said. It is a novel. It is not about Mr. Trump. The lawyer's job, in that moment, was to defend the legal category of the work, not to argue about who recognized themselves in it. Trump sued her for $25 million. His argument was that the novel was the marriage with the names changed, and that publishing it voided the settlement. He had just won the appellate division ruling that cleared him to proceed. He called it, in a public statement, a great victory for everyone who believes in the sanctity of contracts. The same man had just been divorced for cruelty. He was, at that very moment, also suing to end her alimony on the theory that she was living with an Italian businessman. The contradictions were not contradictions to him. They were leverage. The suit over the novel dragged on for years and never came close to a verdict. She kept writing. In 1993, she published a second novel, Free to Love. By that point, the legal landscape had hardened around her. The courts had given the money to her and the silence to him, and she had decided, or perhaps always known, that she would make her way around the silence in whatever genres were available to her. And then something unexpected happened to her public life. She became, almost by accident, likable. The QVC years, the jewelry lines, the clothes, the beauty products. She went on cable television and sold things to women who had watched her get humiliated in the tabloids and decided, in some inarticulate way, that she was one of them. A New York gossip columnist, watching this happen, put the appeal in a single sentence. Women related to her because she had suffered. America loves someone who gets beaten down and comes back. There is more to it than that, but there is not less. The cable audience did not care about the paragraphs. The cable audience cared about the woman who was still there. In 1995, she began writing an advice column for Globe magazine called Ask Ivana. She would write it for 15 years until 2010. She bought a yacht. She went back on the runway at 52 years old. And she distilled the decade into a sentence she would repeat in interviews for the rest of her life. Don't get mad, get everything. It was the most useful thing the marriage had taught her, compressed into a phrase that could fit on a tote bag. In 1995, she married Riccardo Mazzucchelli, an Italian entrepreneur. The marriage fell apart 2 years later. She sued him for $15 million for violating the confidentiality clause in their prenuptial agreement. She had been gagged by one contract. She had begun using the same instrument on the men around her. Whether this was justice or simply the lesson the world had taught her, applied without sentiment, was not a question she appeared to spend much time on. In April of 2008, she married her fourth husband at Mar-a-Lago. Donald Trump hosted the wedding. The relationship between the two of them in the years after the divorce was never simple and was never explained. They remained in public in some configuration that was neither friendship nor estrangement. They shared 3 grown children and a name that continued to appear in headlines. The wedding at his club was, by every available account, a genuinely cordial event. Then came 2015, and a story that had been sealed inside a deposition for a quarter of a century. A Daily Beast reporter went back to Harry Hurt III's 1993 biography, Lost Tycoon, which quoted her sealed 1990 divorce deposition. In that deposition, she had used the word rape to describe an incident that had occurred in 1989. Trump has always denied it. When Hurt's book had gone to press, Trump and his lawyers had produced a statement from Ivana, printed on the very first page, in which she confirmed she had used the word in the deposition, said she had felt violated by the incident, and said she did not want her words interpreted in a literal or criminal sense. The wording was careful. The statement was the kind of statement that lawyers draft. In 2015, asked about it again, Ivana went further and called the story totally without merit. Trump's lawyer at the time, Michael Cohen, defending him to the reporter, said that a man cannot rape his spouse. He later apologized and called his own comment inarticulate. Every public statement Ivana made on the subject after 1991 was made by a woman who could not legally discuss her marriage without his permission, and who would lose her settlement if she did. The architecture of the gag had been upheld by the courts. The appellate division had reinstated the confidentiality clause in 1992. New York's highest court had declined to hear her appeal. The money and the silence had been distributed as the contract prescribed. In October of 2017, she published Raising Trump, a memoir about her children. It was warm about the marriage. It was unforgiving about Marla Maples, whom she accused of participating in her humiliation. The book was, formally, about motherhood, and motherhood was not in paragraph 9. She promoted it on Good Morning America. She told the hosts, on the air, that she had the direct number to the White House, but did not use it, because she did not want to make Melania jealous. She was, after all, the First Lady. It was delivered as a joke. Melania's office responded the same day through spokeswoman Stephanie Grisham. There is clearly no substance to the statement. It is attention-seeking and self-serving noise, and the actual First Lady plans to use her title to help children, not sell books. On July 14, 2022, Ivana Trump died at her Manhattan townhouse. She was 73. The cause of death was injuries from a fall. Her estate was valued at around $34 million. Most of it was split among Donald Jr., Ivanka, and Eric. There were bequests to a close friend and to Dorothy Curry, the family's former nanny, who had helped raise the children while their mother was running a casino in Atlantic City. Curry had been, in her quiet way, the third adult in that household during the years the plaza and Trump's castle were being run, and the summers in Zleen were being organized around a secret police file. She was buried at Trump National Golf Club in Bedminster, New Jersey. The grave is simple. It is near the first tee, on grounds the club had registered as a cemetery. The grave is not a title. There is no clause in it. What survives her, when the tabloid cycle has cooled and the documentaries have moved on, is the question of what the documents actually said. There was the marriage license, filed in Manhattan in April of 1977. There was the prenuptial agreement negotiated in March of that year, in a room where the woman across the table did not have genuinely independent counsel. There was the STB file opened the same year, codenamed Ivana, which ran through every summer the children spent in Zleen and every phone call Milo Zelnicek made to his daughter about her husband's ambitions. There were the 4 successive prenuptial agreements. There was the deposition sealed in 1990, in which she used the words she would later retract and then disavow. There were paragraphs 9 and 10, set aside by one judge in 1991 and reinstated by an appellate court the following year. There was the settlement, which gave her the houses and the money and gave him the silence. There was the novel, which was a novel. There was the memoir about motherhood, which was not about the marriage. There was the column, the cable lines, the runway at 52, the sentence about getting everything instead of getting mad. The story of Ivana Trump is, finally, the story of a woman who spent her entire life navigating the distance between the document and the truth. She came out of a system that turned official records into instruments of state control, and she entered another system that turned private contracts into instruments of personal control. She survived both. She raised 3 children. She ran hotels and casinos. She made her way back into public affection through cable television and a beauty line, and she wrote advice for 15 years to women who recognized her as one of them. She died at 73 in a townhouse in Manhattan, worth $34 million on paper, and she was buried near a golf course in New Jersey. The marriage had ended in February of 1990, on front pages in New York. It had actually ended in March of 1977, in a lawyer's office, across a table from Roy Cohn. Everything that came after was a long, loud, public negotiation over what had already been settled in silence.